If you've seen my Pedro Cantor Primus conversion guide, you may have noticed the base that I built for that miniature. I created a dark, rocky outcrop that featured a bifurcating crack down the centre with the large green crystals pushing up through it. I really enjoyed building that particular base and I was really happy with the results, so I decided to show you how I created it. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to create an erupting crystal base. I started off with a regular Games Workshop base. This was a 40mm base, but the techniques can be applied to any size. You just need greater or lesser amounts of materials to pull it off. Now, the main material that I used to build the rocky outcrop was cork, specifically a cork floor tile. You can buy packs of these from hardware stores, Amazon and eBay for very little money, and they should last you a long time. The tiles are only a few millimeters in thickness, and so they are a good height to mount your models onto without them looking too precarious. The material is also incredibly easy to work with. It can be ripped into chunks with just your fingers, which is exactly what I did here. I ripped off a chunk that roughly matched the size of the base, which would give me a good amount to work with. With the chunk removed from the tile, I began to tear this down further. I wanted to create a forked crack across the base, which meant I needed to tear the cork into 3 chunks. 2 of the chunks were of the same size, with the third being much smaller. I arranged these on the base to see how it looked, but the sizes and shapes weren't quite right yet, so these were tweaked as needed, and the smaller chunks that I removed, I kept them to one side for use later on. Once I was happy with the way the cork chunks had been arranged, I could begin to glue them. I use super glue for this because it's quick drying and has a strong bond, but you could use PVA or similar glues instead. Now, a quick safety notice. Some people have found that some super glue brands and some types of cork can react, giving off a little heat and some fumes. Personally, from using Army Painter and Gorilla Glue brands alongside cork floor tiles, I've never noticed this, but I would recommend testing this outside before you go gluing your materials together indoors. With the rough shape of the base achieved, I still have a number of smaller gaps around the rim of the base and between the larger cork chunks. I wanted to fill these in with some smaller rocks, and so I turned to the cork once again. Using the offcuts of cork that I've saved from the last step, I continued to break these down further, using a knife at times to get some really small chunks. The great thing about using such a pliable material is that it's easy to get the cork into a particular shape to get the perfect fit in a gap that you're looking to fill. These were then glued into place using super glue. I found adding a little glue to the target location and pressing the cork onto it was the easiest way to apply it. And so that completed the main structure of the rocky outcrop, which meant I just needed to add the crystals. The crystals I used are pre-made. I have seen people making their own from wooden dowels, but the process is much more time consuming, if a little cheaper, than using resin ones like these. I picked these up from Green Stuff World, and they come in a variety of different shapes, sizes and colours. With these crystals, I began to glue them into position along the miniature chasm in the base. Once again, I used super glue for this. I positioned them so that they faced in different directions, sometimes with interlocking with other shards. This created a much more natural look. While some of the crystals were fine as they were, I did adjust some in order for them to better fit alongside the others. To reduce the height, I used clippers to cut them down to a desired size. To change the angle, I used my file to increase or reduce how upright a particular crystal shard was. As I was applying these crystals, I kept in mind how the model was going to fit. As I was adding a Space Marine model, he could easily stand astride the fault line, with 1 foot on each side of the larger cork platforms. Even so, I need to make sure that the larger crystals were positioned away from the centre to avoid any collisions with the model. Once I had finished adding the cork and the crystals, I was still left with a few areas where the base was still visible through the cork. This was especially present around the edges of the base. To fill these in and to add a little extra texture variation, I opted to use some Vallejo texture gel. This is a thick, sandy pre-mixed paste that can be applied with a brush. I use it to fill out some of the gaps, as well as applying a stippling technique over some of the flat sections of the cork, and once dried and painted, it would help to avoid an otherwise dull, flat surface. As the paste is acrylic based, if you do make a mistake, like overspilling onto the crystals, you can just wet a brush to clean it up before it dries. With the base built, it was ready to be painted. I didn't attach the model yet, as painting this without the model getting in the way is far easier. But first, I needed to prime things. The primer I chose was a black primer. I wanted to create a dark coloured rock to allow the colour crystals to really stand out, so black was the most obvious choice. I used some Vallejo black surface primer in my airbrush along with an equal amount of airbrush thinner. This was mixed together and steadily applied to the model's surface. After applying the first layer, I allowed it to dry before hitting it again. The result was a really thin prime surface that wasn't obscuring any details, whilst giving me an excellent surface for my later layers to be applied to. When it came to painting the rocks, I wanted something that was quick and that would help me to bring out the texture in those rocks, which led me to using dry brushing along with the dark grey of AK Interactive's Anthracite Grey. Dry brushing works by loading up a fairly large brush with some paint before wiping it onto a tissue or a piece of paper to remove some of that excess and to help work the paint through the bristles. Ultimately, you should be left with a brush that has very little paint left within its bristles. Once I had prepped my dry brush, I dragged it across the whole base with some quick, broad strokes. This caused the paint to start to accumulate onto the raised edges of the rocky outcrops. However, the deeper recesses remained untouched. As the paint was applied over a black primer, the result was that these areas remained black. This helped to create the illusion of shadows, creating some instant shading and helping to bring out those details further. Using that same dry brushing technique as before, I wanted to add some slightly lighter grey to pick out the edges of the rocky outcrops. To create this light grey, I mixed some pastel yellow into the anthracite grey. Using a pale yellow here instead of a white would result in a warmer grey that would better complement the cooler green crystals. As before, I dry brushed this paint over the rocky outcrops. However, this time I focused the application mainly over the edges of the larger rocks and across some of the smaller rocks. This lighter paint would help to accentuate the details and help to create a greater depth in the model. Finally, I mixed a little more pastel yellow into my previous mixture to create an even lighter grey. This was then very sparingly applied to the most prominent and raised points of the rocks. I began painting the crystals by once again using my airbrush. I grabbed myself some airbrush thinner and mixed in some of AK Interactive's dark green into the airbrush's reservoir to create a thinned mixture. I wanted a really rich green colour for the crystals, and the dark green would give me an excellent base colour for this. Using a thin mixture in my airbrush, I began to slowly apply the dark green over those crystals. I targeted my application mainly from above to help represent how light would naturally fall, leaving the base of the crystals as being darker than the tip. I applied several thin layers here, steadily building up the paint until the top half of the crystals were a solid dark green. As I painted the crystals, the paint did overspill onto the rocks immediately around them. However, this was not a problem. That green that had fallen onto the cork gave the impression of the rocks glowing, which really boosted how bright the crystals would appear once finished. Following on from the dark green, I next used the brighter green of deep green, there's a lot of greens there, through my airbrush, thinning it out in the same way as I did previously. This time around, I focused the application of the paint towards the top halves of the crystal. By leaving the dark green visible, I created a transition from the lighter green and the crystal tips to the darker green at the base of the crystal. The crystals had some really strong hard edges that were perfect for taking an edge highlight. I used the even brighter green of the light green and carefully used a thin brush to paint some lines over the crystal's edges. This lighter green made the crystal's edges look much sharper and more distinct, and further helped to contrast them against the darker surrounding rocks. In addition to highlighting the edges of the crystals, I also used this paint to pick out some of the edges of the rocks that were facing the crystals. This helped to further enhance the glowing effect of them. To finish off the painting, I once again picked up some pastel yellow and mixed it into the light green that I'd used in the previous step. Using this extra light green, I applied a very small dot to the very tip of each of the crystals to really boost the sharpness of the detail that I had started with the first highlight. And here we have the completed base. After painting, the only things I did to finish off were to clean up the lip of the base and to give everything a protective coat of varnish. Now you may be wondering how to add a model to this base, and the answer to that is pinning. I've already covered this technique a lot in previous videos, so I'd highly recommend checking out one of my previous tutorials for more information on how to do that. I do really enjoy making interesting bases for my models, so I hope that you enjoyed this guide, and if you would like to see more of these kind of tutorials on the channel in the future, then please do let me know in the comments below. And so, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links. Your help is what helps to keep this channel alive and what allows me to build these bases and all my conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out the description, and please do subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed it. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.